I don't think Trump's intimidated by Putin, but again, there's a line of thought in his administration that is clueless. That again, Russia considers the United States to be its principal adversary. Russia's acted energetically against American interests, not just in Europe, not just in Ukraine, and that by allowing Putin to win in Ukraine, not only are we strengthening Russia in Europe, weakening ourselves in Europe, but sending a signal of weak leadership, which will hurt us not just vis a vis Russia, but vis a vis China. Uh, there's a reason why the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan say it's important to defeat Putin in Ukraine to deter Xi in China. So this is understood by some in Trump's camp, but clearly not by those who have the most influence at the present time. So this is dangerous too.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are joined by Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre, Ambassador John Herbst. Ambassador Herbst served at the US State Department for 31 years and was US Ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006 when George W. Bush was president. Welcome to the programme, Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
This week, Russia bombarded the Ukrainian capital with ballistic missiles and drones in one of the most deadly attacks since the start of the war. That was within hours of Donald Trump accusing President Zelensky of being the biggest obstacle to a peace deal. What do you think of the timing of that attack?
Well, there's no question, sadly, that the fatuity of President Trump's approach, or the administration's approach, is encouraging Putin to think that he can achieve the goal of achieving effective political control of Ukraine. And since Zelensky is not about to surrender, he's trying to terrorize Ukraine into surrender.
And Donald Trump's immediate response was to take to Truth Social and appeal to President Putin to stop, he said, and say he wasn't happy. Is that a proportionate response? And do you expect more?
Well, I was glad to see it, given some of the other things we've seen coming from President Trump. But certainly, the day after Putin's minions murder 10 or more civilians in Ukraine, in Kiev, the tone of President's address to Putin was much milder than the tone of his address to Zelensky for having the temerity to say that Ukraine cannot accept the recognition of Crimea as Russian territory.
Yeah, and it did come out, as you say, he had accused President Zelensky of being that key obstacle to peace and a
Right,
deal
but
for
we
Ukraine.
know that's nonsense. It's not Zelensky who turned down the general ceasefire proposal a month ago or the naval ceasefire proposal of 2 weeks ago. It's Putin. It's clear the obstacle does not live in Kiev, he lives in Moscow.
So, I mean, why do you think that Donald Trump is not using more leverage when it's blatantly obvious to everybody else that Putin is playing for time, stalling, while having this facade of wanting peace and absolutely doing the opposite?
Um, I'm not certain. Here's my best understanding of it. Uh, Trump is a man who makes decisions on the fly, although he does have certain instincts. He is susceptible to advisors. We know that there are naive people with serious influence in the Trump administration who believe that the United States has no stake in Russia's aggression in Ukraine, who refuse to understand that the Russian government calls the United States its principal adversary, that thinks in the same fatuous way as Barack Obama that a reset with Russia makes perfect sense, and they currently have more influence than the sensible people around Trump.
You were saying just before that you were quite pleased by the immediate response by Donald Trump on
Well,
social
I would
Truth
drop the quite,
Social.
but pleased, yes.
Okay, quite pleased. Great. I mean, we're talking in the early days, and anything could happen within the hours after this conversation, even in terms of Donald Trump's response. But what do you
Correct.
think the proportionate response should be from the US president?
Look, um, President Trump, many weeks ago, should have begun to put real pressure on the Kremlin for refusing to make peace. Certainly, after they refused the general ceasefire, it was clear who the obstacle to peace was. And there are two forms of pressure that would make sense. One would be more economic pressure, sanctions. And I would include in that an idea that Secretary of the Treasury Bessent was speaking of very positively before he was sworn in, which was pushing to transfer the $300 billion worth of frozen Russian state assets to Ukraine. But we've heard nothing on it. So that's one, economic pressure. The single best thing, though, would be for the president to permit, either via purchase from Europe or loans to Ukraine, the dispatch of new and more advanced American weapons to Ukraine. He doesn't even have to announce it, just do it. The Russians will see it because Putin believes that the United States is in the process of withdrawing its support for Ukraine, and Putin, can therefore proceed with taking much more of Ukraine and establishing his effective control in the country.
Mm. It's interesting what you say could be done, should be done, but actually when you look at the facts, it seems to be the opposite. If you look at those high-level talks that were supposed to take place between the US, Ukraine, UK and France in London and Germany, they were downgraded this week simply because the US's top diplomats, Marco Rubio and Steve Wickoff, walked away at the last minute, apparently had a diary clash. Do you think it was because President Zelensky refused to agree with that US proposal for the US to recognize Crimea as Russian?
I think either explanation is plausible. I understand why many people think it's because it was done as a form of pressure on Zelensky. Maybe, maybe not. The key remains that the disposition of the administration and the steps they've taken are encouraging Putin to continue his war. And they fly directly in the face of Trump's stated goal of achieving quickly a durable peace. Trump could do that if he acted energetically and with strength on the general parameters of his durable peace, which is something like a ceasefire in place, no NATO for Ukraine, at least for some period of time, but European troops deployed to Ukraine to deter future Russian aggression, and major arms supplies, including from the United States, to deter future Russian aggression. But that outline, which was clear at the first days of the Trump administration, seems to have gotten lost as the administration is putting far more pressure on the victim of the war, Ukraine, far more pressure on the leader of the victim, who in fact is open to Trump's peace initiative, than on the aggressor and the principal impediment to Trump's own goal of a quick, durable peace.
And to that point, as well as Crimea and the status of Crimea, the leaked US peace proposal would recognize other land occupied by Russia as de facto Russian. There'd be no NATO membership for Ukraine, a minerals deal for the US, and US sanctions would apparently be lifted on Russia. If President Zelensky did agree to that, what would he be agreeing to? To surrender?
These proposals, these different elements that you've described, would put Putin in a much stronger position to come back for the rest of Ukraine. Correct, with zero responsibility for the United States. This is a formula. What we're seeing for a Russian victory, not just a savage and dreadful future for Ukraine, but a major geopolitical defeat for the West in general, and a signature blemish, a huge blemish on Trump's foreign policy chalkboard. He would look like Putin's poodle were he to do this. That's why I still hold out some optimism that the sober voices around Trump will be able to point this out to the president, and we might see an adjustment. But we can't count on that, but I don't rule it out.
And what do you think of the significance of the reports that Trump is seemingly prepared to do that, to make Crimea, recognize Crimea, the US recognize Crimea as Russian now, when during his first term, he agreed a declaration indicating the contrary, that it
Correct.
couldn't?
Look, this is it would be a huge mistake for the United States, for President Trump. We've had a clear precedent, 85-year-old precedent, going back to at least the Soviet seizure of the Baltic states, that we do not recognize legally, de jure, the annexations based on conquest. And as you pointed out, Trump himself reaffirmed this during his first term. So why he would give this up, except under the very peculiar notion that Putin can only be persuaded by carrots and not by sticks, which seems to be the approach of the administration. We see sticks for Ukraine and bonbons for Putin. Not anyone who knows Russia knows that is a joke of a policy.
The Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, says that the Trump administration now is trying to simultaneously achieve a full ceasefire, a peace settlement to end the war, and develop US-Russia economic relations all at once. Isn't that totally unrealistic?
It's funny, and I don't think either administration or either president would like what I'm about to say. But we're seeing Trump following Obama in the last 2 months or 3 months. Obama had his fatuous reset with Russia. Biden, knowing that reset was a bad word, tried a stealth reset in the spring of 2021, but smart enough not to talk about it. But Trump has embraced the concept of a reset at a far worse time than when Obama made his mistake. So Trump is following Obama on this, and Trump is following Obama on Crimea. Trump, when he was fulminating against Zelensky, said, Ukraine didn't fight for Crimea in 2014. Now, that was a true statement. What Trump left out was Obama's contribution to that. The United States and our major European allies were telling Ukraine, do not fight Russia over Crimea. So Trump is following Obama on the reset. He's following Obama on being very weak on Crimea. And this is not a Reagan-esque policy of peace through strength.
And Trump's in a rush, isn't he? He wants everything all at once now. Is it all about him meeting that vaunted target to have a deal by 100 days in
Look,
office?
I don't know if that deadline is weighing hard on Trump. I understand why some people think it is. But there's no question that the stakes for the United States, the stakes for Trump's historic legacy, is far more important than any evanescent timeline. So if in his haste to get an agreement, Trump accommodates the aggressor, making further aggression in Ukraine likely, Trump is playing with his legacy, playing a very dangerous game with his legacy. And I think that in some way he understands that, even if those naive advisors do not.
Mm. The US Special Envoy, Steve Wickoff, is off to Moscow this week. What do you think he will try and do?
I'm sorry to say that the editors of the Wall Street Journal, who in large measure support Trump and his policies, have taken a right measure of Mr. Wickoff and his abilities in this job. And it was not a pleasant one for Mr. Wickoff because it was an honest assessment of the weaknesses in his performance. I don't expect anything different when he returns to Washington from Moscow with whatever message Putin's designed especially for Wickoff and Trump. There's a reason why the Russians refused to deal with Kellogg.
What do you think Wickoff brings to international diplomacy?
Well, he's obviously an extremely successful businessman and a loyal friend of Donald Trump. Those are qualities I can understand would be appreciated in the White House. He has yet to demonstrate competence on the international stage, even if he had some success in the Middle East.
And what do you think the chances are that, as threatened or warned, the US may tire of working out a peace deal in Ukraine and simply walk away?
Well, here's the thing. President Trump is the president of the United States. He inherits the policies that he received. Now, obviously, he can and should change them as is appropriate. But the United States provided substantial support for Ukraine. And in fact, it was smart for us to do so. I was a critic of Biden's policy because I believed he was intimidated by Putin's nuclear bluster, which is why he slow rolled weapons to Ukraine. He didn't want Ukraine to make too many advances on the battlefield because he was, again, intimidated by Putin. I don't think Trump's intimidated by Putin. But again, there's a line of thought in his administration that is clueless. That again, Russia considers the United States to be its principal adversary. Russia has acted energetically against American interests, not just in Europe, not just in Ukraine. And that by allowing Putin to win in Ukraine, not only are we strengthening Russia in Europe, weakening ourselves in Europe, but sending a signal of weak leadership, which will hurt us not just vis a vis Russia, but vis a vis China. Uh, there's a reason why the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan say it's important to defeat Putin in Ukraine to deter Xi in China. So this is understood by some in Trump's camp, but clearly not by those who have the most influence at the present time. So this is dangerous too.
To the point that so if President Trump does walk away from Ukraine and pursuing a peace deal in Ukraine, who stands to win?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. Putin wins, but so does North Korea, which is fighting in Ukraine. So does China, which has backed Putin in Ukraine, and to a lesser extent, Iran. And I say to a lesser extent because at least Trump has been going after the Houthis, although not directly after Iran, which is also something he could do better at. But the biggest national security issue in the world today, the biggest security danger in the world today, is Putin's war on Ukraine. And Biden at least made sure, with all of his weaknesses, that Putin could not win. If we stop sending weapons to Ukraine, and again, I know Trump will not provide weapons as gifts. If we stop sending weapons to Ukraine, and as a consequence, Putin's able to take effective control of the country, which remains his objective, that would be a signature geopolitical defeat for the U.S., and Trump would be the principal responsible party for that.
And how do you speaking to us from Washington? How is this all going down in the US? Is it a topic of hot debate, or are the public sharing Donald Trump's frustrations?
That's a very important question. This is clearly a Trump administration move, although I keep saying administration as opposed to Trump himself, because I think that there are different streams around him. Just the stream which is producing bad water has the greater influence at the present time. Uh, but we know that certainly a large number of Republicans in Congress, maybe even a majority, are uneasy about this latest turn of events. But Trump still has a great deal of political capital as a result of his strong victory in the elections last year. And so far, the Republicans in Congress have been reluctant to speak up publicly. We saw some Republicans speak up publicly as their constituents were damaged by uh, the early elements of Trump's tariff policy. Trump, I think, smartly retreated some on tariff policy in response to both the stock market, more importantly, the bond market, and Republicans coming to him and saying, this is a problem. Uh, we haven't seen that yet on Ukraine, but it is true that polls taken over the last couple of weeks show that something like 69% of Americans think that the aid we're giving to Ukraine should continue or actually be boosted. And another poll showed that 61% of Americans correctly see that Trump is weak on Putin. That yet is not having an impact because, again, the Trump team feels that they have the wind at their back from their elected win. But as other things begin to become a little bit more difficult for them, we can see these factors kicking in again to strengthen the sound team of policy advisors in the administration.
You talked to me a little bit earlier about Trump and the kind of things he says and the actions he does or doesn't take being influenced by whoever is closest to him and advising him at that particular time. What do you think he actually really wants from Ukraine and from the conflict?
Look, all I can point to are the things that he has said regarding what he wants as a final result, which is a durable peace. In other words, a peace that would cohere, would continue, not permitting further war or further Russian gains in Ukraine. Uh, but again, if that's his objective, what we've seen over the past 2.5 months is the wrong way to go about it. and I've already explained why. But I don't rule out that, again, there are advisors who are clueless that Russia considers us to be its adversary, that Russia's working closely with Iran, North Korea, and China. And even people who are naive on Russia seem to understand those other three countries are our foes, but they refuse to look at it. They don't understand, for example, that without Russian support, there would be fewer missiles in Houthi hands, for example, and that Russia has provided great support to Hamas as it waged its campaign against Israel. Uh, so there's not been a recognition among members of the Trump team that Russia is in fact a problem. They think Trump can somehow walk away and disclaim any responsibility from the Russian conquest of Ukraine. History won't treat him that way. It will be his defeat far more than Biden's if that were to happen. And I think that's one reason why the sensible advisors around Trump may eventually hold the higher position, the stronger position.
What do you think the sensible advisors around President Zelensky can be telling him now?
The reason I'm laughing is this. Zelensky has been a superb wartime leader in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And he's had to deal with real difficulties which he should not have had to deal with in the United States. First, the whole issue of the so-called Trump perfect phone call with Zelensky in July of 2019. So he had to walk a tightrope there, which he did, I'd say, very well. Then with an administration, the Biden administration, which took energetic and substantial action to prevent a Russian victory in Ukraine, but were too timid to enable Ukraine to actually put the Russians back on their heels, which we could have done. And then he has to deal with a new Trump administration, which is taking steps which could lead to the eventual defeat of Ukraine if they continue. And he's managed this overall well. But there's been one real problem in his dealings with the Trump administration. And this reflects, you might say, the cold calculations of power and the peculiarities of personality. He needs the United States more than the United States needs Ukraine. Although I believe the United States doesn't need Ukraine, and our policy should reflect that, because Ukraine is chewing up Russian forces. But knowing this power differential, knowing President Trump's unhappiness with any criticism, Zelensky should learn that silence is golden. I watched carefully the full video of the Oval Office meeting. Zelensky was annoying Trump, and he had been warned not to do that by many of his friends, including some of his American friends. It's true that in the Oval Office, Zelensky had to make 2 points. A, he needs security guarantees because you can't trust the Kremlin. And B, Putin has a long record of untrustworthiness. He could have made those points in 2.5 minutes. He went on for 25. No. Putin reads people really well. So when Trump correctly called Putin the obstacle to peace in his first or second or third time in office, day in office in the new term, Putin was silent. Every Russian and his cousin slammed Trump for that. But Trump only pays attention to what Putin says and to what Zelensky says. So when Ukraine does not like steps taken by the administration, and they need to express that, Zelensky does not need to be the voice. Yermak does not need to be the voice. Let it be the foreign minister. Let it be the defense minister. Let it be the head of the Rada. But President Zelensky has not learned that lesson, although he's been told that many times.
Just want to draw on your experience as ambassador to Kyiv. The US embassy there has been under intense pressure in recent months, understandably so. Ambassador Bridget Brink has resigned this month. Before that, a member of the embassy's press service is reported to have done the same. How difficult is it for diplomats to do their job in Kyiv right now?
Look, the job I was a career diplomat, right? And you are taught from your very first day in the Foreign Service of the United States that the person who is ultimately responsible for foreign policy is the president, and he exercised that usually through his Secretary of State as well as the National Security Advisor. And your job, no matter how august your position in the State Department is to implement the policy decided upon by your superiors. Now, obviously, the higher up you get in the State Department, the greater role you have in helping to formulate the policy. But your job is to implement it. So when an administration changes, an ambassador always submits his or her resignation. The new president does or does not receive that resignation. And if you stay on the job, you are meant to implement the policy of the new president. I think Bridget did that. I know that many colleagues and friends of hers who cheered her on in her first couple of years in Kiev were disheartened because they didn't like the policy. Uh, she may well have been disheartened, which could explain her resignation. I have not seen her since she resigned. I suspect I will at some point in the not too distant future. And I understand and respect that. But if she's going to stay in place, she has to implement the policy. Otherwise, we're not an ordered democracy. There has to be discipline.
So it's put up and shut up.
Yes.
So, just finally, a few weeks ago, I want to get your perspective on this. A leading UK analyst said to me that he expected that President Zelensky would be presented with an unacceptable peace deal, and that what's going on or has been going on is a process of leading him to that point and almost like framing him as the bad guy for not accepting a deal that is totally unacceptable to him. Do you accept that? And regardless, do you see a pattern in the way these negotiations are being conducted?
Well, I understand why people think that uh, the administration or parts of the administration are trying to establish a narrative suggesting Zelensky is the obstacle to peace. You have to be blind not to see the incidents which produce that theory. So I don't rule it out. I do believe it won't work if this is where the administration is going. I don't have any doubt that half of President Trump's political base, so you're talking about a quarter of Republicans, and so roughly an eighth of the American people buy this, which is why there's a lot of anti-Zelensky animus in Trump world. Of course, this has been a theme going back to the impeachment in 2019. But while that number is significant, it's not overwhelming. So there are a large number of what people call Reaganite Republicans who are unenthusiastic about what they've seen from the Trump team on this issue over the past 2.5 months. So they're not going to be fooled by this. Obviously, the Democrats, for their own partisan reasons, are not going to be fooled by this. So you add that together, you've got 75% of the American public. And the polls I referred to kind of underscore what I've just said. That doesn't mean that, again, naifs around Trump don't think this could work. They may well think it can work. They'll just be unhappily surprised if they go this route and we see dreadful consequences for Ukraine, for the American image, and for American interests.
And Ambassador, would you like to be working in Kyiv right now?
Well, I'm in Kiev at least every few months. Uh, I'm always willing to go into an administration unless I think that uh, they're ultimately unable to pursue the right policy, in which case I'd rather be outside pointing out how their policy could be better. I am glad that there are sober people in the administration pushing for the right policies. If I had an opportunity to join, I would not. I probably would accept it, but I'd be astonished if I was offered that opportunity.
watch this space. Ambassador Herbst, good to speak to you. Thank you.
Nice to speak to you too.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. If you'd like to know more about the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe and sign up for a membership. You can also get more analysis by listening to Times Radio or read thetimes.com. But for now, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.